Good morning and welcome back to the Spirit of Scotland 1314. It's always been an interest of mine to try and build a comprehensive picture of the events and environment at Scotland's most famous battleground, the Battle of Bannockburn 1314. To use modern methods to put the pieces of the jigsaw together to try to build a bigger, more comprehensive picture of the events that took place on those 2 days, on June the 23rd and 24th, 1314. The Battle of Bannockburn symbolically remains the most important battle that ever took place on Scottish soil. And reconstructing the events of those 2 days in June 1314 relies heavily on contemporary chroniclers whose views are shaped by their own perspective, and often we have to look at different chroniclers and conflate their stories to see if we can bring together a coherent picture of what happened on those 2 days. Doing that will let us understand the battle with a greater degree of precision, and we will be able to build a narrative of exactly what went on those 2 days, because there is a bit of a mystery about some of the events and the timings that took place on the battle. So today we are going to look in particular at one of those stories. One of the events that illustrates both the richness and the limitations of the contemporary chroniclers is the attack by David II Strathbogie, the Earl of Atholl, who we will call Atholl, the Earl of Atholl from now on, his attack on Cambus Kenneth Abbey behind me here. Atholl, who once sided with Robert the Bruce, now turned against him. And it's through looking at his events that we can examine the personal tensions and political fractures that existed at the time of Bannockburn. And also, through his actions, we can look at the environment that existed and the conditions that existed through his actions and his attack on Cambus Kenneth Abbey. They are told through the epic story written by John Barber, the Bruce. So let's just listen for a second to what he has to say about those events on the 23rd of June 1314 by the Earl of Atholl.
With gloomy look he would declare he wished the field had been unfought, which such bereavement to him brought. Except Sir Walter 'tis not known that he for any man made moan. He loved him for his sister's sake, whom he his paramour did make, scorning his own wife, Isabel. Therefore much enmity befell twixt him and David, Atholl's lord, her brother, who the sight abhorred. Lord Atholl captured on the night, when the two kings prepared to fight, the food at Cambus Kenneth stored. Assailed the camp, put to the sword of the defenders not a few, and William Herth their captain slew, for which he was thereafter sent from Scotland into banishment, and of his lands as forfeit seized, the king disposed what way he pleased.
Isn't that interesting listening to Barber's verse there? Indeed, what's contained in that wouldn't be out of place in one of today's modern dramas, wouldn't it? It's got mystery, political intrigue, infidelity, revenge and murder. Barber's verses reflect the personal tensions that must have existed between the Bruces and Atholl. Edward, of course, who was perhaps engaged or married to the Earl of Atholl's sister, and she was pregnant with his child. But Edward had spurned her for the sister of Sir Walter Ross, a good friend of Edward's. So he was having an affair with Isabella, the sister of Sir Walter Ross, at the expense of the sister of the Earl of Atholl also interestingly called Isabella, who was pregnant with his child. So that must have created in itself quite some considerable tension. In addition to that, the Earl of Atholl was married to Joan Comyn. Now, Comyn is a family that was bitterly opposed to the Bruces. They had fought together over many years, and indeed Robert the Bruce had killed the Red Comyn at Greyfriars Kirk in Dumfries many years before. So there was great enmity existed between the Comyns and the Bruces. So what a situation that existed there. It must have created many personal tensions. Edward, who had spurned Atholl's pregnant sister for the sister of his friend Sir Walter Ross, and the fact that Atholl was married into the Comyn family, who were the great enemies of the Bruces. What a melting pot of personal tension that existed there. However, at some point, Bruce had seen the value of the Earl of Atholl. Now, Atholl's dynasty goes back a number of years. They were major landowners in Scotland. And indeed, Atholl's father, John, had been in the service of both the English and the Scots at some time in the past as political allegiances and boundaries changed over the years. But latterly, he had come into the service of King Robert the Bruce. But for that, when he was captured by the English, the Earl of Atholl, David Strathbogie's father, was hanged and beheaded at the Tower of London. Subsequently, titles passed down to his son David, and it was David who also went into the allegiance and the service of the English at some point, but he was persuaded to come back to Scotland, probably with promises of getting all his lands and earldoms back. And he was given a prestigious position. He was made the High Constable of Scotland. So what is a High Constable? The High Constable is somebody who would look after the military machine of Scotland, the army. He would look after the organisation, the training, bringing it together, organising it. That is a major position. So from the year about 1312, he was the High Constable of Scotland. What would make someone who was obviously in the inner circle of Bruce's entourage turn against him? And what were the events that he carried out? Well, let's look further and see how this tangled mess unfurled as events leading up to Bannockburn took place. What we know is that by 1314, Atholl had defected to the English. Whether that was for reasons of personal resentment or political calculation, perhaps just a belief that the English army, which was the biggest that had ever marched forward into Scotland at that time, was probably going to be victorious in his mind, and how he got that wrong. We won't know the reasons that he defected, but it could have been a combination of all three. But his defection, and we don't know when it happened, which is an interesting point in itself, culminated in his attack on Cambus Kenneth Abbey. Now, we know the battle took place over 2 days, June the 23rd and June the 24th. And when we look at the contemporary chronicles of the first day of the battle, we don't see Atholl's names mentioned anywhere. Now, if he was High Constable of Scotland, you would think he would have a leading position in one of the divisions that took part in the first day's fighting. But we don't see it anywhere. We have Edward, Robert's brother, we have Douglas, we have Thomas Randolph, the Earl of Moray. We have Bruce himself, of course. But we don't see Atholl anywhere. Now, had Bruce deliberately left him out of his organisation, if he had done, that would have come as a huge insult to a man whose official title was a High Constable of Scotland, i.e. organising and running the army. So we can only presume that his defection perhaps came before the first day of the battle. And as I say, had he got note of the size of the army? Was it for personal resentment reasons or political calculation? We don't know. But my own view is, because he's not mentioned on the first day of the battle, and in his position as High Constable, he would certainly have been involved in a major capacity. Because he's not mentioned, my thoughts are that he had defected before the first day of the battle. So let's look at the events about what the historians think took place on the 23rd of June, when Atholl attacked the abbey. Now, the purpose of the attack remains open to interpretation. Many historians believe he attacked Robert the Bruce's baggage train, which they believe was kept here at the abbey. I find that a bit difficult to comprehend, considering that the Scots army was camped a lot further to the south, quite a distance away from Cambus Kenneth Abbey. So it seems a bit unusual that he would have his baggage train here. There may have been supplies left over here from the Scots' attack on Stirling Castle when they were trying to dislodge Philip Mowbray, and this is what the whole Battle of Bannockburn episode started over. There may have been something there. Some people believe it was to prevent Bruce from outflanking the English and making a rear attack across the Abbey Ford onto the Carslands where the English were camped. Or others that he just meant to plunder the stores there and perhaps raise English morale after they had gotten a bloody nose on the first day of the battle, being defeated by Robert the Bruce. So whatever the reasons for the attack, it kind of highlights the fluidity of personal and political loyalties that took place around the time of Bannockburn. And Atholl's actions are a case in point of that. Surviving evidence of what took place that day is limited. We do rely solely on the information on John Barber's poem, The Bruce. But looking at the actions of Atholl that day will help us better understand the environment and the tactical landscape in which both the Scottish and English armies operated that day. And also we will be able to look at the conditions of the environment and see what was possible and not possible as Atholl carried out his attack on Cambus Kenneth Abbey. And we could see the pressures that existed on both armies as the conflict was about to come to a conclusion the next day on the 24th of June. Now, most historians agree that Atholl's force crossed the Abbey Ford here, behind me, from the position of the English camp on the south of the river on the Carsland. He would have had to cross the Abbey Ford at low tide. Now, people have crossed here for millennia. It is a known crossing point. But we do need to have a low tide to make it accessible. And we have to have the timing of that tide. Are they able to do so? Was it an afternoon crossing or was it an evening crossing? Was it light enough or was the tide low enough for that to be able to take place? So let's have a wee look at that and see what we can decipher from looking at some modern data and see if we can decipher what happened that evening. Now, the state of the River Forth here behind me becomes central to understanding the actions of Atholl that took place on that day on the 23rd of June. He had to cross at a low tide. It was only ever possible then. Now, we know that the tides are primarily governed by the lunar movement of the moon, and it is inherently difficult to calculate, especially going back as far as medieval times. It is inherently difficult to calculate tide times from so long ago. But we can do so. We can use the data tables such as with ArcelPixels, and we can use reference tides from other known local areas around that time. Indeed, we have reference tide times from the River Tay from the year 1210. and we can cross-reference and back-calculate those times to see what time the tides would have made it available for Atholl to cross here. And also, the historians tell us, or Barbara tells us, that he crossed at night. Now, crossing a river even at low tide at night time in the darkness would be very, very hazardous, unless there was a certain amount of illumination. So what was the condition of the moon on that summer's day or summer's evening back in 1314? Well, that's more easy to work out. And we do know that the moon was a waxing gibbous moon. It's about 70% illumination, about 5 days before a full moon. So on a clear night, it would provide some quite bright illumination to help cross this ford here. So what about the conditions of the tide? Well, as I say, we can back calculate through known quantity of tides elsewhere and using Astropixel's data tables, we can back calculate and figure out tide times. And we know from that the two low tide times on the 23rd of June 1314 were 12:15 in the afternoon and midnight, which was actually the early hours of the 24th. So, given that John Barber tells us he crossed the Abbey Ford and raided Kenneth Abbey during the night, he must have crossed the Abbey Ford here just after midnight on the 24th of June to carry out his act. So by figuring out precise lunar and tidal times here on the River Forth, we have been able to bring together a much more accurate historical narrative of the Earl of Atholl's actions on that day when he raided Kenneth Abbey. Now, what happened after the raid? As I said, most historians do believe that he crossed from the English positions on the south of the Carse after midnight, as we have established, on the 24th. At low tide, they've crossed this, raided this. What did he do after it? There's not much written about that. Some people say he just disappeared into the night. Other people believe he's come back across the water and back to the English camp. But we do not hear much about his events on day 2 of the battle. We hear no writings of his participation in that battle. And I also have another thought. Given that he had such a prominent position in the Scottish Army, he'd be well known. We don't know exactly when he defected, but we must also consider that perhaps the Earl of Atholl was already on the north bank of the River Forth, and that when he raided the Abbey, he came in from the north side, raided the Abbey, and only had to cross the Abbey Ford once as he made his way towards the English camp. So it's a consideration, and it's a worthy consideration, that he was already on the north bank. As I say, information is limited, so we have got to conflate the information that we have and bring it together in what we think is a coherent narrative. So there are two possibilities. He's crossed from the south bank from the position of the English camp after midnight at low tide, attacked the Abbey, killed the captain, William Hirth, took the supplies, recrossed the Abbey back to the English positions. Or he was already on the north bank, and being known perhaps would have made it quite easy for him to gain a certain amount of access. He's got there, he's raided the Abbey, killed William Hirth, crossed the Abbey Ford once after midnight, and made his way towards the English camp. So there's two possibilities here. But the narrative is conditioned by the facts that we know now, the lunar conditions, the illuminations. We were 5 days before a full moon, a waxing gibbous moon with 70% illumination, and a low tide that existed just after midnight between the 24th and 24th of June. A much more accurate narrative of the events of the day. In the end, the environmental evidence supports a coherent narrative. Atholl has crossed either from the south or from the north bank. He has crossed Abbey Ford under a moonlit sky at low tide and carried out his axe. It would have been extremely hazardous either way crossing this Abbey Ford, and it just shows you how resourceful these people were back in the day. Now politically, Atholl had made the wrong decision, hadn't he? He had betrayed Robert the Bruce, and for whatever reasons, personal, political, he had sided with the English, probably believing that they were going to be victorious on the 24th of June. Well, he got that wrong, and he got banished by Robert the Bruce. He was stripped of his lands and his titles and considered a traitor. And indeed, latterly, he did go into the service of the King of England and was made the Constable of Northumbria. So always landing on their feet, some of these lords back in the day. And indeed, when you look at the history of David Strathbogie, he actually changed allegiances 4 times. So you've got to consider, was it perhaps through the personal defence and honour of his sister that he done so, or was it more calculated, political and financially suitable for himself? Well, I believe the latter. When you've changed allegiances 4 times, you're doing it for some great benefit. And although I'm sure he would have been a bit annoyed at the infidelity of Edward, Robert the Bruce's brother, with his sister, I don't think that in itself would be enough to allow him, to want him to change allegiances. He changed for practical, financial and political reasons. Seeing the size of the English army, I believe that he decided that they were likely to be victorious, and he was buttering his bread to make sure that he came out all right at the end of it. He got it wrong. He went ultimately back into the allegiance of the English king, and history continued from there forward. But what we have done today, by looking at the story of the Earl of Atholl, we have learned more about the tactical landscape of the Battle of Bannockburn, about the lunar conditions, the waxing gibbous moon, 5 days off a full moon, which on a clear night would provide some suitable illumination, about the tide times on the River Forth at Cambus-Kenneth here, knowing that at a night crossing he would have to wait until after midnight on the 24th, midnight on the 23rd, into the early hours of the 24th before he could cross. So we have gained a greater understanding of the environmental conditions that surrounded the battle, and we've put another little piece of the jigsaw in so that we can better comprehend the bigger picture. So thanks for joining me today. It's been a fascinating look, a fascinating insight into the Battle of Bannockburn once more. So if you've enjoyed this, like and subscribe. Stay tuned for more stories coming up, and also an update on what is happening with regards to development that is taking place in and around the battlefield. We continue in our quest to highlight the loss of the battlefield area, and perhaps further down the line help to preserve and enhance existing places that are left. So stay tuned. Thank you for your time. Have a great day. Remember, like and subscribe, and I'll see you in future episodes. Bye for now.